A few weeks ago, we made a centuries-old summertime succotash recipe using fresh sweet corn and baby lima beans. If you haven't seen that episode, I encourage you to go and see that now. Today, I'm going to be making yet another traditional Native American soup that would have likewise been enjoyed by the early pioneers. The Native Americans often called this dish the Three Sisters because it contained corn, beans, and squash. Thank you for joining me today on 18th Century Cooking. As I mentioned earlier, in a previous episode, we made a summertime succotash using fresh corn and fresh beans. But for most of the year, these fresh ingredients were not available, and so they would have used dried corn and dried beans. Today, in this episode, we are going to be using dried hominy and dried beans as well. Now, we hope to have an episode in the not too distant future about making hominy. And hominy is mature corn. Usually it's dried and soaked in a caustic solution of hardwood ashes and water to remove the outer hull. The hominy that we're using today is of a very special variety. In the 18th century, corn was typically of the flint variety. And the corn that we have today is generally of the soft kind, which is a dent corn that was developed in the mid-19th century. The other varieties of flint corn that we'll have today are generally popcorn and some kinds of Indian corn that hasn't been hybridized. The flint corn we're using today is a very special kind of corn. It's a heritage corn that has its origins in corn that's over 2,000 years old. It's called Iroquois white corn, and it's available online at the Iroquois White Corn Project. In addition to this being a heritage variety of flint corn, it's already been turned into hominy for us and dried. So they've done a lot of the work already for us. It's treated just exactly the way the Native Americans in the 18th century and before that would have done it, as well as the early settlers. To make this ready for us to use, all we need to do is soak it overnight, the same way we need to do with our dried beans. You want to soak these in their water until right before you use them. Be sure not to use your bean soaking water in the cooking of this dish. So let's get started. Some of the old travel journals mention these types of soup having wild game meat in them. And actually, traditionally, you'll hear about bear meat being used in this type of dish. And bear meat's exceedingly good and tastes a lot like, say, a fine beef. Now, I don't have bear meat today to use in this recipe, so I'm going to be using a fine chuck roast that I've already cubed into 1-inch squares. Let's brown this meat in a little bit of butter along with some onions. And then I'll season it with salt and pepper and a bay leaf or two. Next, I'm going to add some stock. Now, I've got some chicken stock here. You could use just water instead, or even beef broth. To this, we'll add the corn and the beans, the first two sisters. I'm going to put the lid on this and let it simmer about 3 hours. Our soup has been simmering for 2.5 to 3 hours, and now it's time to add our vegetables to it. And I've got 4 vegetables here. I've got rutabaga, I've got carrot, I've got some parsnip, and of course the third sister, which is the squash. These I'll drop in, and this will cook for another half hour or so until these are nice and tender. Well, here is our wonderful Three Sisters soup, or I might even call this a stew. It's so rich and thick, and the smell is wonderful. Let's find out what it tastes like. Now, this is full of a lot of different flavors. I mean, obviously, we've got the meat and the wonderful broth flavors, but the interesting textures are what really, I think, sets this apart. And the corn is something totally different than you're probably expecting. This corn is much larger in its size than a standard piece of corn, and it's got a really, really good texture. It's not hard, but it keeps holding its texture, whereas the beans have almost broken down. They're very soft. but the corn really is still holding its own in there. So we have some really interesting texture with it. But we also have all these different flavors, so you get a piece of parsnip and you're gonna get a totally different flavor. You get a piece of, rutabaga, you got another flavor. You get the meat, you get the corn, you get the beans. It is really a wonderful medley of flavors. Each bite is almost just a little bit different. This is such a wonderful recipe, and I hope you get a chance to try it.